Hi, everyone, and welcome to our student webinar, What Do Clerks at the Supreme Court Do? With Amy Bergquist. We're really excited that you're here today and to have Amy with us. Amy is a former teacher, and she'll tell you a little bit about her career. She clerked for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg from 2010 to 2011, and she now works at the Advocates for Human Rights. And Amy's joining us today from northern Minnesota, where it's still snowing. So maybe some of you are in her neighborhood. We are Street Law. My name is Kathy Ruffing, and I work at Street Law. And this is a little bit about who we are. I know that your teachers all teach you that you should consider the source of the information that comes to you. So we want to make sure you know who we are. We're a small nonprofit that works to promote democracy and law-related education. And we are nonpartisan. So when you entered today, you took a poll. So we would have a little idea of who you are all out there. So if we could see the results of the poll, you can get an idea of who is joining you. Ben, can you show the results of the poll, please? There we go. Excellent. So half of you are government students. That's good for us to know who our audience is. And it looks like we have a couple teachers and other students of other subjects. Great. Okay, so I'm just going to talk super briefly about how to participate in the webinar. First of all, some of you already submitted questions because you were prompted to do that. Thank you very much for that. You're going to see your questions embedded in the presentation. And if it's not worded exactly the way you did, we had a lot of questions that were very similar. So some of these questions are compilations of questions, but you may see your question in there in other people's questions as well. The other way to participate live is on your toolbar, you should have a Q&A that allows you to put questions in the Q&A right now. Please look through the questions that have already been submitted. If someone has submitted a question that is very similar to your question, instead of submitting it again, please upvote those questions, because at the end, we'll give priority to the questions that have been upvoted the most. So you're actually more likely to get your question answered if you upvote a similar question than putting in the question again. Please give preference to students on this, teachers. So let students have the preference in questions, although teachers, certainly, if you want to go in and upvote student questions, that would be welcome. You can also put follow-up questions in the comments. So if there's a question that's similar to yours, but you have a little bit more of a comment to put on it, you're welcome to add those. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to throw our first question to Amy. About, we got this question a lot, and that question is, what did you do before you were a Supreme Court clerk?
So first of all, hi to everyone. This is really fun for me, and thank you to Street Law for the opportunity. In terms of what I did before I was a Supreme Court clerk, I did a lot of things. I was in my mid to late 30s by the time I clerked at the Supreme Court, which was unusual. Most of the law clerks were in their 20s. But I first did undergrad. I got a college degree, and then I was a high school teacher for 11 years. I taught at South High School in Minneapolis, which you see on your screen. And I taught social studies, especially civics. I taught social studies for English language learners. I also taught Russian, and I coached debate and speech. And so what you see in the picture on the right is one of the speech teams that I coached. So then after I decided to go from teaching to law school. So I spent 3 years in law school, which is normally how long law school is. And then right out of law school, I had 2 other judicial clerkships. So clerking for a judge or justice isn't just something that happens at the Supreme Court. It happens in the lower courts as well, and also in the state court system. So I had 2 other judicial clerkships before I clerked for Justice Ginsburg. And also I spent 1 year in private practice working for a law firm before I went on to the Supreme Court. So that's what I did beforehand.
Great. And at what point in your life did you know you wanted to practice law?
Well, it was always something sort of tickling around in the back of my head. When I was in high school, I was on the debate team, and I really liked the sort of research and argumentation side of things in debate. But law school, at least in the United States, is something you do after you get your undergraduate degree. And when I was in college, I took the law school admissions exam. I had been thinking about it at that point. But I wasn't ready to be in the classroom for another 3 years. So I decided I'd do something else. So I went and got my teaching license and was on the other side of the classroom. So it was something that I was thinking about, but I also really loved teaching. And I think what finally motivated me to go to law school was working with my English language learner students who were primarily refugees from East Africa, and hearing about their experiences and the human rights violations that they and their families had experienced. I was always interested in refugee issues. And I thought, well, maybe I can take my love of argumentation and research and also my interest in human rights and go to law school and see if I can do something sort of on a larger scale to address those human rights violations. So that's when I decided to take the plunge and go to law school.
Great. So one of the questions we got the most was, how did you become a Supreme Court clerk? And you've already alluded to the fact that maybe your journey was a little different than most people. So we'd love to hear your answer to that question.
Yeah, so my career trajectory was a little non-traditional because I had another career before I became a lawyer. But in terms of the nuts and bolts about how you become a clerk for a justice on the Supreme Court, it's like any other job. You submit an application. So I submitted a resume and a cover letter and a writing sample, and I was advised by the professors at my law school that I should apply to all of the justices, even though based on my resume there were certain justices that probably wouldn't be interested in me. They said apply to them all anyway. So that's what I did. And the first time around I didn't get any takers, didn't get any interviews, and then the second time around Justice Ginsburg's chambers called me to organize an interview. At that time I was clerking for a judge out in San Francisco, and it's not like corporate recruiting or anything. I had to pay my own way to go to Washington, D.C. and do the interview. So I interviewed with Justice Ginsburg, and before that interview I talked with a lot of her other former clerks that I was put in touch with about what is the interview like, how should I prepare, and I was warned that it was possible that she would make me the offer on the spot, which is what she did. So I was glad I was prepared for that, because otherwise I probably would have been quite shocked. And the interview happened in June or July of 2008 for a job that started 2 years later. So with that offer in hand, then I had 2 years to do some other things before going on to clerk for Justice Ginsburg. But that's sort of the nuts and bolts of how I got the job.
Great. So we have a poll for students to take now about how many clerks they think work at the Supreme Court each year. So this question came up a lot, but we thought before we had Amy answer it, we'd ask you. So take a moment. So your options are 380, 190, 100, 76, 38, or 9. Okay, take a last chance at the poll, and then Ben's going to show us the results. Okay, how'd they do, Amy?
They did very well. So each justice, and of course there are 9 justices on the court, and each justice is entitled to 4 clerks. In past years, I think Justice Rehnquist wanted only 3 because he wanted to play tennis with his law clerks, wanted to play doubles or something like that. But in recent memory, each justice has had 4, but then you'll say, well, 4 times 9, that doesn't work out to 38. And you'll see on your screen, these are the law clerks from my year. And if you count very carefully, you'll see me, I'm the second woman on the right-hand side. If you count very carefully, you'll count 39 for my year. And so the math just doesn't add up. 9 times 4 is 36, not 38 or 39. And the reason being that each of the retired justices is entitled to have one law clerk as well. And so in my year, which was the first year Justice Kagan was on the court, there were 3 retired justices, Justice O'Connor, Justice Stevens, and Justice Souter, and each of them had a law clerk. And they use that law clerk however they want. So Justice O'Connor at the time and Justice Souter were hearing cases at the appellate level. So they would use their clerks for preparing for those cases, but they didn't need their clerks on a full-time basis. So they would also ask a justice to take their clerk under their wings. And so some justices actually had 5 clerks working for them, one of whom was sort of seconded to the chambers by one of the retired justices. So that's why you'll see 39 of us there, the 4 that were directly assigned to each of the 9 justices, and then the 3 who had been assigned to different chambers by the retired justices they worked for. So that's the team from my year.
Awesome. So this is actually the very first question that we got moments after we put the webinar out there on social media. This question came to us. So since it was one of the first questions asked, we thought we'd raise it first. So what would you say to a high school student who thinks that clerking for a Supreme Court justice is only for crazy smart kids with lots of connections?
Well, I'd say a lot of things. And first is don't sell yourself short. You might be one of those crazy smart kids. And certainly grades do matter for clerking at the Supreme Court. But connections sometimes matter and sometimes don't. So I will say that going to a good law school can help, and some law schools have stronger connections to the justices. There are some professors at the top law schools who can just call up one of the justices who's, you know, they have that kind of a relationship, and they'll say, oh, I have this really great student. I'd like you to consider them as a law clerk. Would you be willing to give them an interview? I didn't go to one of those top law schools with all of those great connections between the justices and the professors. I went to the University of Minnesota Law School, which is a really good law school. It's in the top 20 nationwide. But I didn't have any professors who had the direct line to any of the justices. There's another way in which you get sort of access to clerking at the Supreme Court, and that's through this concept of what are called feeder judges. So at the federal appellate level, there are some judges who have a good relationship with one or more of the justices, and they will recommend their current clerks or their former clerks to a particular justice to say, I'm really impressed by this particular clerk. I hope you give them a shot, have an interview and all of that. So that direct recommendation from a judge who has the trust of a justice can also play a role. And so I was really fortunate that the judge I was clerking for in San Francisco, whose name is Willie Fletcher, was willing to put in a good word for me. And so, on my own, I wouldn't have had any of that success, but it was really in part due to Judge Fletcher and his good working relationship with several of the justices that he was able to put in a good word for me. So I didn't have the connections myself. I was just fortunate. And how did I get a job clerking for Judge Fletcher? Well, that's also, each judge is different in terms of what they're looking for in terms of hiring. For me, it was kind of chance that I had been a high school teacher and Judge Fletcher's wife had been a high school teacher. And so his judicial assistant happened to see my file in the pool of applicants, and Judge Fletcher gets hundreds of people applying to clerk for him as well. And so his judicial assistant sort of flagged my application and said, oh, this is a person from the University of Minnesota. You've never had a clerk from that law school before, but she was a teacher. She has kind of an interesting story. So sometimes you make your own connections just based on whatever your personal story is. And I also think that I want to emphasize that it's not sort of the end all and be all to clerk at the Supreme Court. There are other jobs at the Supreme Court where you don't need to have those kinds of top grades or connections. There are judicial assistants who work there on a permanent basis. There are also chambers aides who are generally almost straight out of undergrad. They go through the marshal's service, and that can be really interesting to be working directly for a justice. You're not doing the hard work that all the law clerks are doing, but to work in the Supreme Court and to work directly with a justice is a great opportunity. And throughout the court systems, both federal and state, there are a lot of different job opportunities out there that you can look into if you're interested in the law but not sure if you want to go to law school. There are a lot of great, interesting jobs in the court system, and a lot of them are really stable jobs as well because the courts will always be there. So I recommend you look into that as well if you're thinking about career opportunities.
Great. Well, Speaking of clerking for a justice, so this is by far the question we got the most, and something to this tune, lots of different ways to phrase it, but what was it like to clerk for Ruth Bader Ginsburg? So we know that she's very iconic, and that she is otherwise known as the notorious RBG. We've probably seen her workouts. Yeah, so we'd love to hear your inside scoop on what it was like to work in her chambers.
So it was busy, first and foremost. You know, it was a great opportunity for me and for anyone, but I was also really glad it was just a one-year position because it was really a busy time. It's really hard work to be a law clerk, and the justice works even harder than her law clerk. So she wants to make sure that everything is as good as it can possibly be. She is very careful about her use of the language in opinions and all of that. And so it's just, you have to be on your A game all the time. But it's also really inspirational. She wasn't yet notorious when I clerked for her in 2010, 2011, but of course she is iconic, and she was at the time as well. And so it's just kind of, it takes your breath away to say, I'm working for this person. Now, working for the justice doesn't mean that I'm working, sitting side by side with her all day. She has her office where she's doing her work, and then when she needs a law clerk, she'll call them in to meet with them and work with them directly. It's a matter of just being available to the justice whenever she needs you. And we did get a chance to see her trainer, Bryant. He would come by twice a week to work out with her, as he does now. And so he's a really, really nice guy. And so it was always fun to chit chat with him. And he used to joke around about the justice doing one-armed push-ups, and we were never quite sure whether he was joking or being serious that the justice was doing one-armed push-ups. She is quite tiny, and so I was thinking, well, she doesn't have as much weight to push, but still a one-armed push-up sounded like maybe he was pulling our leg there. But it's just, amazing to work with the justice, and she's brilliant, of course, and just to have the chance to absorb some of her brilliance is really a privilege.
Great. So the next question came up a lot as well in some way, shape, or form, and that is, what are the main duties and responsibilities of a clerk? So you alluded to that a little bit in the last question, and does it vary from clerk to clerk?
So I would say that all of the clerks for a particular justice, or for a particular judge for that matter, have the same basic job. They might be assigned to different cases, but they do the same type of work, preparing for those cases and working with the judge or justice in terms of writing opinions or assisting with research for those opinions, etc. So I would say that within a particular chambers, the duties of one clerk aren't particularly different from the duties of another. There's one exception at the Supreme Court. One of the clerks in each chambers needs to have a higher security clearance in case there are cases or case materials that come through that require that. So I was not the security cleared clerk, but that's a really pretty minor part of the job. In terms of what the main duties are, and this applies to clerks at the US Supreme Court as well as at in other courts, we do what our boss tells us to do. So however our boss, the judge or justice, wants to use us, that's what we're there for. So it can be preparing them for oral argument, it can be assisting them in whatever way with drafting an opinion, and it can be all sorts of other duties as assigned. So I remember for the justice's birthday, we were sort of part of her entourage. She was invited to the Kennedy Center for an opera performance, and we went along with her and got to sit in the presidential suite or booth to watch the performance. And then after the performance, there was an after party, and we accompanied the justice to the after party and got to see Placido Domingo sing happy birthday to her. And that was not something I would have guessed would be part of my duties as a law clerk, but it was. Also helping your judge or justice prepare speeches to deliver. That was one of my duties, preparing a speech for the justice to deliver. And at that time, there had been a New York Times article about that concluded, based on laughter lines in the transcripts of oral arguments, that Justice Ginsburg was the least funny justice who talks. And so meaning that Clarence Thomas had fewer laugh lines, but because he rarely talks. So Justice Ginsburg, I think, maybe wanted to make fun of herself in that regard in delivering the speech, and there was some good self-deprecating humor that she and I worked into the speech to do that. So wouldn't have thought that I would be a speechwriter, but if that's what your judge or justice wants you to do, that's what you do. And in terms of whether the justices use their clerks in the same way, you may have, if you study the court, heard about the certiorari pool or the cert pool, and we have the clerks are responsible for doing sort of the first cut of all of the petitions that come into the Supreme Court. And maybe it's a good time for a poll about how many petitions are filed with the Supreme Court, because the clerks who are part of the cert pool divvy up all of those cases, and every case gets a hearing by one of those law clerks in the cert pool. So that's a busy part of our work week, is every week going through those petitions for certiorari and doing a write-up of them. So how many cases do you think get petitioned to the US Supreme Court each year? You can vote in the poll there. And just keep in mind that with 8 or 7, I'm not sure how many justices are part of the cert pool right now, you would divide those up among the justices, and then that each justice is responsible for that number of petitions divided amongst their law clerks. So it ends up being, you know, even if it's the smallest number on the list, it ends up being a lot of petitions that the law clerks have to take a look at. And we don't just take a look at them and say, oh yeah, let's grant this one, or yeah, let's deny this one. We have to write up a memo for each case we're assigned to. And those memos might be 1 page, they might be 20 pages long, looking further into the cert petition and looking into what the merits are and making a recommendation, not just to your justice, but to all of the justices about whether a case should be granted. So that's a big responsibility that clerks at the US Supreme Court have, that other clerks who work for judges at other levels don't have, is working in this cert pool. And the justices also, in some cases, will rely on their clerks to make a recommendation to them directly, not just a recommendation overall to the justices, but do you think we should be considering this case? And when clerks from other chambers make a recommendation, doing a second look at that to see whether it's a case that the court should grant cert on to review. So can we look at the results of the poll here to see what we have? All right, so about 40% of you said it was between 7,500 and 10,000, and on average, you did a great job. On average, it's between 7,000 and 8,000 a year. I did some looking at the statistics from last year, and last year, for some reason, the numbers were a little bit lower. They had about 6,500 last year. So if you chose the 5,000 to 750, you're more up to date with your information than what historically has been the case. So that's a lot of petitions, and so the law clerks I was getting probably 12 to 15 every week that I needed to review and examine. And then you look at, so the court is getting around 7,000 petitions each year. What percent of those actually make the cut and get oral arguments? So take this poll now and let us know if you've, I know Street Law likes to cover this when it does its Institute for Teachers. So take a look, and how many cases does the Supreme Court actually grant or accept for certiorari each year? So those are your answer choices there. Go ahead and give it a vote. And the results of this poll, when we get to it, will give you a sense of whether it's particularly rare in that stack of 12 to 15 cert petitions that I would get every year, every week. Would it be rare for me to recommend that the court grant certiorari, or would it be rare for me to recommend that they deny certiorari? So is it time to look at the results of this poll next? All right, very good. So about 75 cases get heard by the court each year. That's right, 44% of you got it right. So that's a really, it's a really low chance that your case is going to be taken up by the Supreme Court. So when people say, oh, I'm going to take this all the way to the Supreme Court, it's like, yeah, you chances are really good that your case will be denied if you go to the Supreme Court. But these petitions are the first step, and the petitions aren't to say, I'm right and the court below got it wrong. The petitions should be written in a way to try to persuade the court that this is a case that the Supreme Court should take. And the Supreme Court doesn't take cases just because they were wrong, just because they were decided in a wrong way. The Supreme Court takes cases because they meet the Supreme Court's criteria. And if they're not going to take very many cases, they're going to take cases that help the Supreme Court do its job. And its main job is to help resolve differences among the lower courts. So we call that a circuit split. And so that's one of the things the law clerks are looking for when they're, going through the cert pool and writing cert pool memos. Here you see an example of a cert pool memo that's been disclosed from the archives. I wrote hundreds, if not, I guess it wouldn't be thousands, but I wrote many hundreds of cert pool memos during my year at the court. And you'll see this one was an 11-page cert pool memo, which is unusually long. But you'll see on the very last page in the middle of the bottom line is the last name of the law clerk who wrote the memo. So there are a bunch of cert pool memos, and these are all in a database that you can search. So there are a bunch of those that say Bergquist in the bottom middle. So those cert pool memos go through the information in the case, the necessary facts, what the lower court said, and then make a recommendation to the justices about what the court should do with the case. And this is one of those rare cert pool memos that recommends that the court grant the case. And in the alternative CDSG, there are a lot of abbreviations in these cert pool memos, call for the views of the Solicitor General, which is the sort of representative of the legal position of the executive branch, with Justice Kagan having recently served as Solicitor General. So that's a cert pool memo, and you see the notations of the justice on the cert pool memo as well, giving his, in this case, thoughts about whether they agree or disagree with the recommendation of the law clerk. And because as a law clerk, you're writing the recommendation not just for your own justice, for all of the justices, you need to be really careful that you're being measured and fair and balanced to all of the justices and their law clerks who might be reading it. So it's a really important job, and it's also a little bit stressful because a lot of times the petitions for certiorari aren't written by lawyers. They're written by people who are representing themselves. And there might be a good case there, but you kind of have to do a lot of the legal work for them to dig around to see if there's something to it. So you might have 12 to 15 of those cert petitions, and some of them might mean a lot of work on your part. Just to get to an answer that it should still be denied, you want to make sure you get it right. And so that can take up a lot of time on the court. And in terms of going back to the question about whether the justices use their clerks in the same way, different justices will use their clerks in different ways in terms of writing opinions as well. Some of the justices will take an initial cut at writing a draft opinion and then have the law clerks plug in the citations to the law. Sometimes the justice will give their clerks an outline of an opinion and have the law clerk sort of fill in what the legal standards are that should go in, what the facts are in the record. Each justice is a little different, I think, and then also each case is probably a little different too in terms of how they use their law clerks for that. So hope I covered enough of that question.
Okay, so we got this question a lot too, Amy. What aspects of being a Supreme Court clerk were the most challenging and rewarding?
So what I found the most challenging and also the most stressful were the stay of execution cases. One of the things the court is handling throughout the year is when there is an execution scheduled in a death penalty case. Usually there are last minute filings to the US Supreme Court to ask the court to stay the execution. And those cases are assigned to the justice based on the circuit where the execution is coming from. And Justice Ginsburg didn't have any in my year where there was an execution coming out of her circuit because her circuit doesn't have a lot, or I believe now any states that retain the death penalty. But you still get notice and you're just sort of waiting to see what the materials are in the case, what the issues are that they're going to raise. You can do some sort of pre-reading, you get some advanced materials, but you're really waiting until the last minute and you know the hour and the minute when the execution is scheduled to happen. And it's really high stress. So you're waiting for the justice or the law clerks of another justice to circulate a memo with a recommendation recommendation, and then you have to be able to respond right away on the spot. You have to know exactly where your justice is and how to reach her, and you have to be ready to make a recommendation. And it's you know, the highest possible stakes when somebody's life is on the line. And just to give you an example, this happened the year before I clerked, but there was a man by the name of Hank Skinner who was 35 minutes away from being executed by the state of Texas when the Supreme Court granted a stay of execution. Since that time, because in my day job now, I do a lot of work to try to abolish the death penalty, I've met his wife, and so she recounts what her perspective was in, you know, being that close to having her husband executed. So the court issued a stay with 35 minutes to spare, and then my term actually heard the oral arguments in his case and gave him some relief. He's still on death row, but it's really a high stakes when somebody's life is on the line and when there's such time sensitivity to it. So I'd say that's the most challenging part, for me at least, of being a law clerk, was those types of cases, really stressful, and you know, you never walk away feeling very good about it, because you know, usually the person is going to be executed and you feel like there has to have been something more that I could do. In terms of rewarding, I found it rewarding just to make sure that every person, or do my job to try to ensure that every person filing a petition with the Supreme Court got a fair shake. Whether it's somebody who's imprisoned and feels like they've been wronged and maybe they don't have a good legal claim, just making sure, just double checking and doing my best to make sure that their case is getting a fair consideration of whatever claims it is that they were bringing to the court. And of course, also really rewarding to work with the justice and to work as part of this institution. So those are the things I would add.
Well, I think your answer about what is the most challenging also has a connection to one of your most memorable cases. This question was asked by a lot of students as well. You can talk about this case and others too.
Yeah, and we're not, in terms of the rules of chambers confidentiality, we can't say which cases we worked on as a law clerk. A lot of justice rules assign a law clerk to a particular case. But I will say that the Hank Skinner case that I mentioned came out of Justice Ginsburg's chambers, and it went the right way. It was a 3-6 decision, allowing him to get a sample of his DNA for DNA testing. So that was a really good victory in terms of the death penalty. And then the picture you see me is with at a meeting of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, where I'm one of the vice presidents, and I'm there with a guy by the name of John Thompson. And John Thompson was the respondent in a case that came before the court my year. He was actually a success story. He was exonerated. He had been wrongfully convicted by the state of Louisiana and sentenced to death, and was ultimately exonerated. And his case came to the Supreme Court about whether he was entitled to damages. He had been issued a jury verdict with a substantial $1 million award for his wrongful conviction based on the prosecutor's misconduct in that case. And he's involved with this organization called Witness to Innocence. And so in our work against the death penalty, we do work with Witness to Innocence. And so I had a chance to meet him, which was really just amazing to meet one of the people that was, you know, the party in a case that was before the court. And he was really excited to know that I had clerked for Justice Ginsburg that year. So I really remember that in part because of this sort of personal connection. The case came out the wrong way. So Justice Ginsburg was on the wrong side of a 5-4 decision, and that decision took away John Thompson's multi-million-dollar jury award. So it's memorable in a really sad way, but also as a positive note that I was able to meet him and see how he's doing. He was really remarkable in terms of the way he got on his own 2 feet after being released from prison. Sadly, he died last year, something unrelated to his imprisonment, but he had a health ailment and died. But I was really felt fortunate that I was able to meet him before he died. Another case you may have studied in school, if you've studied Supreme Court cases, is JDB versus North Carolina. That one came through the court my year as well. That had to do with whether a court should consider a person's age in determining whether they're in custody for purposes of Miranda, the Miranda warning. And JDB was a 13-year-old, and his petition came through our chambers my year, and it was really interesting because if you're filing a petition for certiorari, there's a filing fee, but if you can meet the income standards, you don't have to pay it. You can be an informa pauperis. petitioner, and the filing fee is waived. And you have to explain why, though. And so I remember seeing his IFP form that said you have to explain why you don't have the income to file the fee. And he said, I'm in middle school, I don't have a job. And well, of course, a 13-year-old doesn't have their own independent source of income. So that was just kind of fun. It was very human, and he had to sign it. So even though he's just initials in the court case, we could see his name and his 13-year-old signature on the court filing. So that was a really neat case, just because having been a high school teacher, I could connect really well with that, and just sort of the personal face of the petitioner as well.
Do we want to do the poll, the Informa Papyrus poll?
Sure. Maybe first ask the poll about how much, did we do the poll about how much does it cost to file a petition?
Sure. Okay, Ben, can we have the how much does it cost poll? There we go. So our poll is, how much does it cost to file a petition for writ of certiorari with the U.S. Supreme Court? $10. Oh, we have $10 price. $300 or $500.
$10 is $50, for example.
Yeah. Make that second 10 100. 10, 100, 300,
Sure.
500.
And I'll say this is just the filing fee. Also paying the lawyers, a lot of people, if they have a good case, will get lawyers to do their work free going to the Supreme Court, because for a lawyer, that's a really big deal to take a case to the Supreme Court. But if you're paying lawyers, it can be, just to file this one brief, the petition for certiorari can cost $20,000, maybe even more. So it's not a cheap endeavor. So let's see if we have some results to this question. Can we see the poll results? Very good, 300. That's some obscure Supreme Court trivia. Well done to the 68% who guessed correctly. And now, as I mentioned, and you maybe know if you studied Gideon versus Wainwright or other cases, you don't necessarily have to pay that $300 fee if you can qualify as a low-income petitioner. So that would be Informa Papyrus, or IFP. So in the 2018-2019 term, what percent of cases that were filed Informa Papyrus? So what do you think? What proportion of those 7,000 or so cases were IFP cases versus paid petitions? And there you have a lot of different answer choices. And I looked this up just by doing the Supreme Court docket, because each case has a number, and the numbers for the paid petitions start with 1. The numbers for the IFP petitions start with 5,000. So I just entered in, 5,000, 6,000, et cetera, to figure out how many IFPs there had been, and then how many paid petitions there had been. So let's see how you did with this one, which might be more obscure trivia than you're used to. Yeah, not as good about this question. I think I may have stumped you. The correct answer is 75%. So 3 out of every 4 petitions that comes to the Supreme Court is an IFP, an Informa Papyrus petition. So most of the people who are submitting those petitions aren't wealthy, they're not businesses, and they are able to get that $300 fee waived. A lot of them,
those people incarcerated?
A lot of them are incarcerated, and some of them are handwriting their petition, and some of them, in a lot of cases, they may have been wronged in some way, but their petition doesn't meet the criteria for the Supreme Court to grant cert. But there are also some really interesting stories in some of those handwritten petitions. So it's always, you always really appreciate the humanity of the people who are representing themselves, sending their case to the Supreme Court, along the lines of the classic Gideon versus Wainwright case that at least civics teachers like to reference.
You're going to ask one more prepared question, and then we're going to look to the Q&A. This was another question that came in from a lot of people who sent their questions in via email, and that is, how did you handle the workload of being a clerk? One of the very first things you told us is that it's very busy, and you have all of those petitions for cert. So how were you able to handle the workload? What prepared you for that, maybe?
Well, I think being a teacher is the best way to prepare, because being a teacher is also a lot of work, especially if you're also coaching after school and on weekends. So I was used to sort of working in a stressful environment where you have to be, on the ball all the time, working really hard. unlike a teacher, a law clerk can't really take her work home with her because you have to maintain the confidentiality of all the court documents. So fortunately, I lived really close to the court, just 2 blocks away, and I spent a lot of time in the evenings and on weekends going in to get all of that work done. And it's, you know, the sort of thing where you have to stay organized, you maintain open lines of communication with your justice, with your other law clerks. And over time, you get more efficient with things. So my first week in the cert pool, I was really nervous about everything. I didn't really have my sea legs yet in terms of how to write those memos. But by the end, you know, after having done it for 11 months, that last month I was a lot more efficient, a lot easier. It was a lot easier to do those sorts of things. But it is a lot of work, and that's, I mean, one of the good things about it being only a 1-year position is that you know that you're going to be finished with it soon, and you're sad to go, but also, you know, excited to have a bit of a break.
Okay, so the question that has the most votes right now, so I'm going to remind students that they can upvote questions, is did you have to do any work as a clerk that you disagreed with?
So, you know, as a clerk, we're not representing ourselves and our own interests. We work for our judge or our justice. And so, you know, for example, working on death penalty cases, I think the death penalty is always wrong. And so, you know, to the extent that Justice Ginsburg felt like she had to, because of the court's rules and what the law says, she had to vote not to stay in execution or had to vote in a case that would, in my view, come out the wrong way. Yeah, I have to do that. If that's part of my duty as a lawyer and as a law clerk is to do that. So, you know, I knew, because I knew of the justice's track record, that, you know, to the extent that the law was consistent with not executing someone, that was sort of, she wasn't pro death penalty, but she also has an obligation as an officer of the court to follow the law and uphold the law. So it's you know, disappointing when that happens, but I'm certainly not going to hold that against my justice for following the law. The problem is more with the law and not with the individual who's applying the law. But, you know, there are sometimes situations where, you know, you wish the court would grant cert in a particular case, but strategically maybe it doesn't make sense to grant cert to review a case because it might come out the wrong way. Or there might be situations where, you know, the law just doesn't allow the result that you kind of wish could happen. So that's really not a flaw with the court itself, but maybe with the laws as they're written, or with the Constitution as it's written, or the way the court in the past has interpreted the Constitution. So it's something, you know, I think people think it's more of a problem for law clerks than it actually ends up being. But had I been clerking for a different justice with a different approach to the law and different ideology, it probably would have been more difficult. But at the same time, I don't know that those justices would have wanted to hire someone with my background and perspectives on the law in the first place. So I guess it all works out in the end.
Okay, so the question with the next number of votes is, how much influence do Supreme Court clerks have over the Supreme Court's agenda?
Really as close to zero as you can get without making it actually zero, I would say. You know, we work for a justice and we help them do whatever it is that they want us to do. So we, you know, you might say, well, the clerks really have a lot of influence on the cert pool. And most of our time spent with the cert pool is looking at cases and doing a lot of work to decide that a case should be denied, because most of the cases are going to be denied because that's what the Supreme Court standards call for. You know, law clerks, sort of the 4 law clerks that work for a justice, might be able to move the needle, persuade a justice, but really the justices are far more brilliant than the collective minds of their 4 law clerks, who are usually pretty close to being right out of law school. So I think the influence that the clerks have is relatively minimal while they're clerks. I will say, however, that a lot of law clerks go on to become really influential litigants before the Supreme Court. That's not a path my career took, but they do go on to work for organizations or law firms that play a continuing presence at the court in terms of, teeing up cases for review, and because they know how the court works, they know how to advise their clients and advise their law firm in a way that strategically will give their cases a better chance of being heard and better chance of coming out the way they want them to come out. So there is some influence, but it's really more after they finish the clerkship than during the clerkship itself.
Great. There was a question about your favorite case, but I think we've answered that, or your most memorable cases. I think we've answered that one. So this question you might decline to answer, but I'll put it out there because it's been upvoted, and that is, what is the most partisan behavior you've seen from a Supreme Court justice?
Wow. I guess it's not about declining to answer the question, but I think in terms of at least when I was clerking, I had the impression that all of the justices sincerely believed that they were doing their job and following the law and following what the Constitution dictates. So their approach to that might have a particular sort of philosophical bent or ideological bent, but I wouldn't say it was partisan. I don't think that's really the sort of an accurate term to describe the way the justices approach the law or approach their work. So I guess partisan isn't really a term that I would use, but that may also be the nature of the particular term when I clerked. So, if you asked a clerk from a different term, if they were being really honest with you, depending on what the case was, they might say, yeah, there was partisan behavior. I don't know. I didn't really see signs of it during my term with the court.
Good. Okay, so this question is a current events question, but I have a feeling you're keeping up on the court. And if you don't know the answer for some reason, I'm happy to, you can batter it back to my side of the court. And that is the Supreme Court in session right now during the coronavirus outbreak, or have they been forced to recess?
So they haven't recessed, but they have modified how they're doing their work in ways that are actually really exciting for a court watcher. So they're still releasing opinions. They released an opinion yesterday that I'm planning to write a blog post for our organization because it has an effect on death penalty cases and unanimous jury verdicts. So yeah, they're still releasing opinions. They are planning to do oral argument by teleconference is my understanding, and the reason it's really exciting to do oral argument by teleconference, which might sound really boring, is they are planning to do the teleconference, broadcast it live, and this will be the first time that people outside of 1 First Street, where the court is, are going to be able to hear live oral arguments. So I am, this is the civics teacher in me is feeling super nerdy excited about this. Like, wow, you can hear it live in real time. It used to be that you had to wait in some cases until the end of the week, or at least until the end of the day for the recordings to be released. So yeah, hearing the Supreme Court live can't get better than that in my view. But yeah, they're continuing to do the work. They're not hearing all of the cases that they had granted and planned to hear this term. They've selected some that as sort of priority cases that they'll hear before the end of the term. And I think it sounds like some of them will be rescheduled for the 2020 to 2021 term.
Great, thanks. So the next question is, I like the way it's phrased, so I'm going to read it verbatim. A clerkship is occasionally described as a gateway job into the legal world and not a final destination. What are your thoughts on this? And we'll combine that with the question, I won't pull up the slide just for that, but a question that was submitted by email about your particular path. And that question was, what is your advice to anybody who wants to fight for human rights as a career, and how did you get started along that path? I think those questions marry well.
Yeah, so whether you're clerking for a district court judge, a state court judge, an appellate court judge, or a Supreme Court justice, it's usually the kind of job that you have typically for a year, maybe 2 years, and usually pretty close to when you finish law school. It's unusual for people to be sort of in mid-career as a lawyer and then become a law clerk. So it is a gateway job in that regard. It's something, it fits nicely with, sort of continuing the scholarship you've done in law school, and is kind of, seems odd to refer to it as an entry-level position, but that's kind of the way the legal profession views it. So it is a gateway job, but it opens up positions in a lot of different directions. So with my current job with the Advocates for Human Rights, I'm a human rights lawyer and I don't represent clients at all. So I don't appear in court. I don't write legal briefs except for the occasional amicus curiae brief. So I have done a couple of friends of court briefs to the Supreme Court, but the direct legal skills that I developed as a law clerk aren't really relevant to my current work, but I still did develop sort of softer skills in those clerkships that help me be a better lawyer today in the work that I am doing. So if you're going into private practice and want to work for a law firm, they definitely, it's very prestigious to have a US Supreme Court clerkship, so they definitely are interested in hiring former clerks. You can get a nice pay bump and a signing bonus and things like that. In terms of my current job, I'm making less than I did as a teacher. So I did not go after the signing bonus and the lucrative career of a Supreme Court clerk going into private practice. Some of them will go into government work and have a position of influence in one of the legal teams in the federal government or in state government. So it is a wonderful thing to have on your resume and can open doors that wouldn't otherwise be opened. In terms of my particular career path, it probably got me some attention from the Advocates for Human Rights, but the skills of a law clerk were not particularly relevant to what I'm doing these days, other than sort of, as I mentioned, the connections to the death penalty cases that have come through the court.
Good. So the next question is, do you think your views changed while clerking in the Supreme Court? And if so, how did they change?
I would say that I learned a lot. So to the extent that in a lot of cases, I just didn't know much about a particular subject area and then had to take a deep dive because the court was looking into a matter. I learned a lot. I would say that to the extent that I had views about things before clerking at the Supreme Court, probably those views didn't change a whole lot during the clerkship, just because if you study something in law school or as a clerk for an appellate court judge, you usually are already pretty well immersed in the law as it exists. And so you kind of can understand the arguments for and against the decisions that the court would come out with. So I don't think those views would have changed a whole lot coming out of the clerkship.
Good. Okay, now they want a funny story or moment that happened. I kind of liked the entourage for our
I mean that's really
story, but
funny story that I can tell because it happened. It didn't happen in chambers. It happened sort of in a quasi-public setting. But I can elaborate that on a little bit. You know, it is a little bizarre to have Placido Domingo singing "Happy Birthday" to the justice you've been working for. But Justice Ginsburg is well known to be somewhat introverted, and she loves the opera and she loves the opera, the people who do opera. So it was really fun at this after party, and the cast was younger opera singers too. So it wasn't sort of really big names in the world of opera other than Placido Domingo, because he ran this program for younger opera singers. But just seeing her be so excited and bubbly about the opera, and she seemed in her element in a very different way from the way we see her with the case books and working on opinions. That was just a lot of fun to see that, especially since it was her birthday too. So it was a fun evening.
That's great. Okay, so this one I'm really interested about personally, and that is, how do you manage all the confidential information you hear? Because of course the justices vote, and then sometimes it's 3 to 6 months before the opinion is actually handed down. So you obviously know probably the decision in that period of time, and it would be a huge breach of confidentiality if that information would come out, and there would be all sorts of repercussions. So yeah, how do you handle knowing all of that inside information?
Well, it's lawyers every day deal with confidentiality, and that's really an important part of our training in law school is, understanding what our ethical rules are that bind us as lawyers, and maintaining client confidentiality, or in this case, chambers confidentiality. So it's really, you wouldn't dream of disclosing anything to anyone just because it's such an important part of your job. And if it did get out, it would be, someone would find out that you were the one who disclosed it. It would be just horrible. I have a friend from law school who clerked at the Minnesota Supreme Court, and she had, and we wouldn't have been allowed to do this with the US Supreme Court because they have a little bit stricter rules, but there was something that happened her year that posed a risk that a draft opinion would be out in the public. And so they, you know, and it wasn't intentional at all, but they had to really scramble to try to address that situation in an urgent basis. And so you just wouldn't ever disclose those things just because you know that it's really important to the integrity of your job and to the integrity of the court, that the first time anyone outside of the court hears what a decision is when the words are spoken at the Supreme Court to release that decision. So it's just something everyone takes really seriously.
Great. Okay, so this one I think was also on the in the slide presentation later on, and so we got it a lot. That means we got it a lot as an email one as well, and that is, what is the most important lesson you learned while clerking for Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
I guess the most important lesson is that she and the other justices really want to, they're doing their best to get it right. And so I think people talk about the court being really politicized and, you know, partisan and all of that. And I really, my biggest takeaway was that everyone, the justices, the law clerks, and even the other staff at the court, everyone wants to do their best to get the correct outcome. And they disagree because, you know, other judges around the country disagree as well. And so they're trying to get it right. They're doing their best, and you may be disappointed with the way it comes out, but everyone is really trying their best to reach what they think is the right result. And that was, I think, my biggest takeaway.
Good. So we have a couple more questions. We only have a few more minutes. And these were some of the the questions that were sent in earlier. And this question is, what advice would you have for college and law school students who want to clerk on the Supreme Court?
Well, clerking on the Supreme Court is kind of like being struck by lightning. So it's, you know, really rare that you get to do it. And there are some things you can do to try to increase the chances, but it's still not the sort of thing that you can count on to say, you don't write in your law school application, my goal is to get my degree and then clerk for Justice Ginsburg, because it's so rare. It's not something that you can count on, but you can do things that will increase your chances. You know, obviously excel in school and do things in a leadership role as an undergrad and as a law student, and also just have a story. You know, you don't necessarily have to go directly from undergrad to law school. Like, I think for me, having a first career as a teacher actually helped me and made me more grounded when I went to law school. It made me a better law student, having been a teacher. So, you know, follow your own calling and do what your passions lead you to do, or, you know, if you can't afford to do what your passions lead you to do, do whatever it is that you need to do, but do it well and make a good impression and be nice to people. So I would also say, you know, be kind, because you never know where that kindness will come around and help you as well. So I really, really encourage you to be thoughtful and kind to all the people you encounter in school and in your work, because I think kindness often begets kindness. So that would be another piece of advice.
Great. We already answered that question. And so what was your biggest surprise going into the Supreme Court? So lots of people talk about sort of the moment that they arrive. And I remember a video where Ruth Bader Ginsburg talks about her first day and just sort of the wave that hits you of the importance of your job. Did you have a moment like that?
Well, it never got old. And it was always, you know, I thought, well, walking into this building the first day, it just seemed so momentous. And up until the last day, it's just amazing to work in that place even for just a year. It's just an amazing institution that is, there's so much history behind it, but also so much influence on our daily lives, the decisions that come out of the Supreme Court. And I guess I was also surprised about how personally touched I would be, even by the cases the court didn't grant. I enjoyed reading the petitions and learning about people's stories. And, you know, it's the kind of thing that makes your day-to-day work as a law clerk a little easier. It's like, who am I going to get to know today based on what certain petitions I read? So that I thought was pretty fun. I didn't expect that.
Great. Well, Amy, we certainly want to thank you, and I'm sure if the participants could join in, they would say thank you as well for sharing all of your experiences. We really appreciate it. And for the participants, thank you for joining us. I know it's various points of the day for you, but for most of you, after a long day, probably of Zoom classes. So we appreciate you coming to join us. If you have questions that you'd like to send to me, there's my email, cruffing@streetlaw.org. You can also find it on our website. And so thank you all for attending, and Amy, thank you.
And thank you all, and thanks to Street Law, and thank you all for the great questions. It was really fun. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.